Now, I spoke earlier about, at the top of the program, about that top-level phone call, the two most powerful men in the world, with Joe Biden and Xi Jinping talking for 2 hours last night. With tensions over the Taiwan Strait so high and tensions between China and the West also sky high, it's a good thing, at least, that they're talking. But our own Prime Minister, former Prime Minister that is, Scott Morrison, remember him, he's brought into these strategic issues overnight as well with a speech in Japan. And China's not really going to like much of what he had to say. Scott Morrison spoke robustly, pretty consistent with his time as Prime Minister, talking up the AUKUS deal with the UK and US and the Quad that includes, of course, Australia, the US, India and Japan. Scott Morrison said, over the last decade, the People's Republic of China has increasingly attempted to reshape our region and the world in a way more conducive to autocracies than liberal democracies. As Prime Minister, he says, I referred to China with Russia as a new arc of autocracy of which the world must be wary. Ain't that the truth? He went on to warn that other nations and perhaps the Albanese government with these words by saying our region must not embrace the path of acquiescence in the face of coercion. So a strong push there back against China. Let me bring in Michael Shoebridge from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. First up, Michael, that speech from Scott Morrison, pretty consistent with what he was saying as Prime Minister, but it won't go down too well in Beijing, especially making it in Japan.
No, but he said similar things when he was the Prime Minister, and I think Beijing and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, hearing these speeches from people in democracies tells them two things. One, it gives them the very clear message that Scott Morrison gave, that China's behaviour is causing China increasing problems in more of the world, as the rest of us notice. And two, in democracies, lots of people get a say and have a public position to speak from, including former prime ministers. That's really healthy when you look at Xi trying to stop someone like Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. In democracies, people get to make more of their own choices.
Absolutely. You could not disagree with a word that Scott Morrison said. And the good news for Australia is the Albanese Labor government has basically footprinted that same position. It hasn't taken a backward step over China since being elected, and that's to its credit because it's a difficult situation. I want to get your read, Michael, on this phone call overnight. You mentioned Nancy Pelosi's trip. That has to go ahead now, doesn't it? Because otherwise it just looks like Washington is backing down.
Well, I think it does, and I think the good news there is despite Xi trying to get Biden to adopt China's one China policy, which says, look, Taiwan's ours, everyone else should just butt out and let us do what we like, Biden reminded Xi that the US one China policy is just like most of the rest of the world's one China policy, which is we recognise the PRC governs mainland China. We recognise that they think they should control Taiwan. We don't necessarily agree with that. And we do not want the Chinese Communist Party changing the status of Taiwan and ending the democracy there unilaterally by force. Xi doesn't agree with that. He thinks he should be left to do whatever he wants with Taiwan, and he wants to isolate Taiwan from the rest of the world. So, of course, he doesn't want a democratic figure out of the US like Nancy Pelosi visiting. Biden left him under no illusions that he can't tell the Speaker of the House of Congress what to do.
Yeah, it ain't China, mate. It ain't China. Let's have a look at a little bit of the White House readout on that phone call.
And on Taiwan, President Biden underscored that the United States policy has not changed and that the United States strongly opposes unilateral efforts to change the status quo or undermine peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah, obviously Taiwan a big focus, but do you get anything from the readout, Michael, that they would have discussed broader issues?
Yes, so they certainly talked. Biden talked about the effect of Putin's war on global security and things like energy and food prices. Xi refused to engage on that, calls it a Ukraine crisis, and hasn't stepped away from him adopting Putin's narrative that this war is all somehow the fault of the US. and Putin is only killing a whole lot of people in Ukraine because the US has forced him somehow to do it. So they talked past each other on that. They raised cooperation on climate change. That's not going to happen either because China wants to use renewable technologies around climate change as a source of strategic advantage and power. They'd love to see Europe shifting from dependence on Russian energy to dependence on Chinese renewable systems. And again, the US is not going to have that happen. So they mainly talk past each other.
It's an easy game for China. They get our coal and iron ore, turn it into their solar panels and wind turbines and send it to the rest of us while they make as much power and energy as they like. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Appreciate your insights.